Hello again. As usual, we will begin with the preliminary meditation. And this time it will be on the very familiar and very hopefully comforting practice of settling our body, speech, and mind in their natural state. So we'll start with something quite simple, and yet we'll spend a relatively large amount of time doing that practice, because we can use it, of course, quite obviously, as a natural expression of all the four immeasurables and the underlying quality of care or tenderness that the four immeasurables grow out of. And that's exactly how we want to practice it in this case. We will use settling body, speech, and mind as a way of taking care of ourselves, of paying attention, kind, benevolent attention to this person sitting here, this complex of body and mind. And after we've done that, we will go into our discussions around the four immeasurables themselves and what it means for these states to become truly immeasurable. Then we'll do an exploration of compassion, which of course is such an important quality in today's world, but also obviously one of the four immeasurables. And in fact, the most popular of the four immeasurables in the Tibetan tradition, the one that's emphasized the most and is mentioned the most. So we'll work with compassion today, exploring the definition, the way of cultivating it, the obstacles to the cultivation of compassion, and so forth. And we'll try to do all of that in a kind, benevolent, gentle manner, where we are gentle both with ourselves and, of course, with the other participants, if we're joining this class live, or with ourselves and with everyone around us, if we're watching the recording, which is in itself, of course, always an interesting exploration. Maybe we're finding ourselves sitting at home, surrounded by our loved ones and our pets and our neighbors and so forth, or maybe we're somewhere in public. Some people use recordings of Dharma events like this in very unusual situations in some cases. Just recently, I was told that someone is using a Dharma book that I narrated, an audio book that I narrated in Russian, as a way, as their aid in falling asleep. So they've taken the idea of they will sleep comfortably, which is one of the benefits of loving kindness, quite literally, and successfully applied it. So they're listening to the book, it puts them to sleep, and that's very nice. And I think that's beautiful. We do deserve good sleep, and we do need to be restful and well rested. So that's one way to use it. Another time, someone told me they've been using the same audiobook when taking a jeep tour around Mount Kailash, which is, of course, close to where I am right now in Nepal, but centered in Tibet, and a very large pilgrimage place for both the Hindu and the Buddhist tradition. And so they're being taken on jeeps around this majestic mountain, exploring the different holy sites on their way. And while all of that is happening, they're just listening to the recorded audio, which I would never imagine any of that happening, and yet it does. So if you're finding yourself right now in a situation where you're listening to this recording or you're joining this class, but it's not in the ideal lab conditions of sitting in your bedroom and just comfortably resting on your meditation seat, that's perfectly fine. We have been training and using loving kindness while walking, both in formal and informal walking meditation. And hopefully we've seen loving kindness start to pervade everything that we do slowly, whether that's chopping vegetables or taking a shower or reading a book or formally meditating, or of course communicating with people, being in a work environment where you have to talk to people. And yet somewhere there's the little fragment of mindfulness still active and reminding us to attend to these beings surrounding us and see them with the eyes of loving kindness. the eyes of loving kindness see beings who can potentially attain greater level of happiness, but have not yet attained that goal, and yet they can. And so our kind wishes, our aspirations for them can support them in that process. Our aspirations can strengthen the threads of reality, or the threads of the strands of interdependence that allow all beings to attain happiness more easily. That's why one way of putting it or explaining it that I think is equally acceptable to both Buddhists and perhaps followers of other religious and philosophical traditions, and to those whose thinking is completely secular and has nothing to do with these ideas of karma and mysterious energies and so forth. In either case, whichever philosophical position we adopt, I think on the most basic level, we do agree that there is the process of causality, there is causality, and there is interdependence to a certain degree. And so what we put forth into that interdependence can help other beings and ourselves attain greater levels of happiness. Well, today we will explore the flip side of that, attaining freedom from suffering. But before that, let's attain some freedom from the suffering of being agitated, perhaps, or the suffering of our mind not being truly focused on these amazing concepts and practices. And to do that, we will rely on the incredible method that came to us from this incredible Indian, or Afghani actually, in some ways of narrating his story, yogi by the name of Padmasambhava. It is through his teachings that we received this practice of settling body, speech, and mind, at least in the form that we're using here. So let's find a comfortable position and enjoy Padmasambhava's kindness as we practice with this method. And so for that, as usual, we can adopt the supine position. We can be in the sitting position with our back hopefully elongated naturally. And we spend the first moments of this practice by adjusting the different elements of our posture. Working with our shoulders, our arms and hands, our neck, and then just sitting comfortably or resting comfortably on our back, and spending some time attending to the sensations in the body. Just as always, we can start with the parts of the body that are currently in contact with the element of the earth. Noticing the firmness, the solidity, the reliability of this element. And then as we breathe naturally, releasing all types of physical tension, allowing all the types of physical tension to melt and to leave our body through these points of contact. And then allowing that experience of ease, of stillness, and yet also of vigilance that allows us to stay awake, to slowly expand and gradually come to the parts of our body that are normally holding some tension, some habitual tension, that might still make our fingers move. That might still mean that there's some tension in our face or in our pelvic floor. And so with each natural exhalation, it's as if we're breathing into all of these body parts and allowing them all to relax. To let go of tension and to rest deeply. Our speech is naturally silent, since we're not using it to say anything right now, but we're also allowing our inner speech to settle down as well as we release all types of stories with a natural exhalation, resting in deeper and deeper silence. And then beyond that, enjoying the spacious, natural radiance of the mind. In this case, still being aware of the body and the breath peripherally. And at the same time, just enjoying the natural awareness that is not necessarily fused with any specific object, but that can hold its own ground and yet illuminate the tactile sensations and the process of breathing. Resting in this union of relaxation, stability, and clarity for our mind, relaxation, stillness, and vigilance for our body, with warm-hearted care for ourselves as this person sitting here, and for each element, each building block of our experience, primarily our body and mind. This practice of letting go is not for the sake of torturing ourselves or punishing or trying to train in a way that would not be kind and compassionate. We're using this practice to release, to let go, to rest, and yet to be vividly aware, so that through that skillful application of awareness, we can experience greater levels of eudaimonic well-being, happiness of being. And then out of this spacious experience arises the positive motivation for this session and all the practices that we're going to do within it. And also all the listening, all the contemplating, all the meditation. The 3 steps leading to the cultivation of the 3 types of insight or understanding. Recalling our highest spiritual or psychological and also communal aspirations for ourselves and for others. And truly aspiring for those. And directing all the practice that we're doing together towards that goal. And with that as our foundation, we come back to the body. We notice the sensations of the body. We ground ourselves in the body, and then we slowly introduce some movement to it by perhaps rocking back and forth a little bit, moving our hands and fingers, smiling to ourselves and to the other participants, maybe also to the beings around us. And with that, slowly concluding this practice and transitioning into our shared online space. Thank you so much for joining. It's always a bit of a challenge to keep showing up in a long course like this. And yet many people still do. And that's actually incredibly encouraging because since the practices that we're working with together are referred to by Dr. Alan Wallace as the universal Dharma, or something that is completely universal and can keep us from suffering and bring us happiness. Any effort we make into mastering these together and working with these together in the context of group practice and group study would be a very meaningful contribution to the well-being of each individual person, but also the community and also the world at large. So we're doing something very meaningful, I believe. And let's continue with that. So we are on session 7 out of the 10/11 sessions originally planned, 10 more universal in that we are mastering the basics of the 4 immeasurables. Then the 11th session is, of course, as I mentioned before, the one where we're going to explore the Buddhist application of the 4 immeasurables beyond the level of using them for concentration, beyond the level of using them for the cultivation of pro-social skills, and beyond the level of simply using them to be happy and not to suffer on the most basic human level. There are some unique applications of the 4 immeasurables that have to do with insight practices used in Buddhism, some applications of these methods within the so-called tantric practice, and that of course requires its own explanation of what does that word even mean and how to understand it properly, and then how to integrate the multiple complex practices used in the so-called Buddhist Tantra with the 4 immeasurables, how to do that properly. There's that. There's the topic of how to use the 4 immeasurables for our lucid dreaming and dream yoga experiences, which of course is also a very interesting, exciting actually exploration, but one that might take some people a lot of time. And of course, some are naturally gifted, so they progress in that very quickly. And then beyond that, how do we essentially interbreed the four immeasurables with the most profound practices that have to do with understanding the true nature of our mind? How do we integrate the four immeasurables with the true practices of, for example, what in the Tibetan tradition is referred to as Mahamudra and Dzogchen? So those are some of the topics we're going to explore. And yet right now, we're focused on the foundation for all of those. Because, of course, as we would often see mentioned, even in the very traditional Buddhist texts used in the Tibetan tradition, but also in many modern day books or teachings, audio teachings, video teachings by such masters as the Dalai Lama and so forth, as we would see mentioned very often, it would be quite a shame to try to jump into the deep end of all these contemplative practices and miss the foundation, miss the preliminary steps, the basics that we need to cultivate first. And yet at the same time, I should say, at least in the tradition that I've been trained in, which makes a lot of emphasis on at least getting some glimpses of these more advanced practices, it would equally be a shame to think, oh no, I'm so simple, I'm so primitive, actually, simple in a bad way. I'm so not gifted, not talented, not intelligent, that I might never even dream. And I shouldn't even dream about these more advanced methods. And so I should only work on the very, 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 very basics and never even look in the direction of these advanced practices. That approach also seems to be very limiting and actually based on the reification of our status as beings who are on the initial steps of the path. So we don't want to reify that. And of course, we also don't want to reify our ideas about ourselves being advanced yogis already and so forth. We don't want to fall into either extreme, essentially. And that's the beautiful Buddhist concept of the middle way. We identify the two extremes, we sleep between them. And this is where our practice of the four immeasurables actually is found right now. We are experiencing some glimpses of profound relaxation, profound ease, even as we're doing this practice that we just did, taught originally by Padmasambhava, certainly one of the most illustrious teachers in the history of the Buddhist contemplative tradition. So we're already doing that, and even if it's not the ultimate ease, it's still a glimpse of some level of ease. That's good enough. And at the same time, we are then thinking, well, how do I go back to the most foundational definitions? What can I explore there? And this is where we will now explore the term that is very often used in the Pali tradition and in the modern day insight meditation movement and in Theravada literature, but that is interpreted in a different way in the Sanskrit tradition. And that's where we want to avoid confusion. So we're going to talk a little bit about the term of Brahma Vihara, the divine abodes, divine abidings, Brahma's abodes, Brahma's abidings. Essentially, the word Brahma refers to Brahma as a specific type of God, and the specific God, that's also a personal name of that God, even though there's also a class of gods in Buddhist cosmology called Brahma. So those heavenly beings, not yet enlightened, born there under the influence of their karma, are said to be resting in these beautiful states that all have to do with benevolence. So one of these states is loving kindness, a profound, beautiful, expansive state of loving kindness, of love, universal love. One of them is compassion, penetrating, beautiful experience of compassion, very powerful and very far-reaching. And one of them, of course, is joy, joy that is playful and boundless and encompasses all beings and finds joy in their delights, in their joys, in their happiness. And then equanimity, where the mind is free of bias and is open to all beings, and yet at the same time not clingy, not trying to grasp at those beings, not trying to pressure them into doing anything. So, and a beautiful combination of that, a beautiful synergy of the four. So it's not mutually exclusive. We can be masters of all the four immeasurables, and in our practice, we do need to be eventually to become masters of all the four immeasurables. But for these beings temporarily resting in that state due to their karmic imprints, there's an interplay of those as well, in terms of how they abide in them. And yet, this is where the Sanskrit tradition adds nuance that is not really, to my understanding, to my knowledge, it's not really present in the Pali interpretation. So in the Pali interpretation, the four Brahma Viharas, as simply, this term is simply used to refer to the four immeasurables. So we would often pick up a book that is either written in the context of the classical Theravada tradition, or we can pick up a book that is written on the basis of the modern day insight meditation movement, which is strongly present in the United States, with such names as Sharon Salzberg and Joseph Goldstein and many others associated with that movement. And this is not to say these teachers are not educated in the more traditional versions of Theravada teachings. It is also not to say that they're not indicated in other traditions, because they have also certainly, some of them have also received teachings from the Tibetan tradition, and Mahamudra and Dzogchen and so forth. But sometimes, depending on the audience they're writing for, they use the register of writing that is known as insight meditation movement, or as the style of the insight meditation movement. So it's slightly different from you would read in a Theravada book written by a Theravada monastic that's been trained in Thailand or Sri Lanka, for example. So there's that difference in style, in the approach, and the presentation, and the emphasis, and the examples used, and so forth. There would be a very large overlap, and also difference. So some things are presented in a more simplified manner to cater to a specific audience and to bring benefit to that audience. So it's not about being picky in this case. It's not about being arrogant and saying, oh no, it's all useless. How dare they step away from the tradition? Not at all that. Once again, while some of the teachers I know are very discerning about such things, and we do need to be discerning, I also think, and this is where I think my thinking is closely attuned to what His Holiness the Dalai Lama says about such things, they also benefit in anything and everything that helps people not kill themselves and helps them practice emotional hygiene and so forth. So that's where we can say, yes, popular mindfulness is quite beneficial, and it's wonderful that people are mastering it. And if beyond that, some people also want to then embark on the profound path of Buddhism, or the profound path of the Sufi tradition, or the profound path of mystical Christianity, or the expansive path of being humanists, are the expansive path of reconnecting with nature and protecting nature and so forth. There are multiple paths that we need to combine and to traverse, or we might choose to. My popular mindfulness would just serve as the foundation for all of that, or any of that. So that being said, in the insight meditation movement, we would often see that the four immeasurables are referred to as the four Brahma Vihara practices. And then after they have been called that, we would see some explanations about how to cultivate loving kindness and how to cultivate compassion and so forth. So the same logic really that we're using here. That being said, in the Sanskrit tradition, as it says here in the slide, this term is sometimes used to refer to the selfish versions of love, compassion, and so forth. The four states that are still highly dependent on their subject, or the four states, that is loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity, which are of the same nature as the four immeasurables that we're aspiring for here. But in this more limited form, they entail a large level of reification around the subject that's sending out love. So how does the Sanskrit tradition describe this? So these divine beings, these Brahma type beings that have attained this magnificent rebirth and are very benevolent through being born in such an environment. They're very benevolent, compassionate, and so forth. While they're resting there, they still are somewhat aware of their own glory, of their own beauty, of their own high and lofty status. And so there's an element of graciously sending out love to these poor, wretched beings that deserve love and that need compassion. And of course, let's be joyful about their joy. And of course, let's not be biased. After all, they're all simple beings, not compared to my glory. So there's an element of that. It's not probably, most likely, it's not as coarse, it's not as gross, it's not as crude as I have just described it, because I'm describing it on the level that's available to me, the human level of thinking. It's probably much more reified there, but the logic is still that, the logic of, oh, from my side, I'm sending all of these. Whereas the four immeasurables, the true four immeasurables that are described in the Sanskrit tradition as something similar to the four Brahma Viharas, but also different. The true four immeasurables would mean that that level of grasping, that level of reification is at least temporarily removed. It has become more transparent, perhaps, even if we haven't attained full on insight. We're still less likely to reify. Because of that, there's not that element of selfishness, of self-aggrandizement even. And this is where we can see that difference by referring to some quotes, such as this quote from the Sanskrit Sutra of the Sublime Essence. Sanskrit meaning it is part of the Sanskrit tradition, and Sanskrit tradition itself includes not only texts that are still extant in actual Sanskrit language, it also includes all the texts translated into Tibetan and then also Mongolian and other languages, and texts translated into Chinese, then Japanese, Vietnamese, Korean, and other languages. So that a very, very expensive body of teachings on these beautiful practices. All of that together is referred to the Sanskrit textual tradition. So the sutra is part of that. In this case, this is a quote translated once again by Padmakara Translations, published by Shambhala Publications. And here's what the quote says. When love and the other three, as compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity, are not backed by, there's a misprint here, backed by bodhicitta and are merely causes of happy existences, they are what we call the four abodes of the pure, that is Brahma Vihara. So when they're not backed by the altruistic wish to become a fully awakened being, when we're practicing them just to attain these lofty states of high rebirth, or just any type of high rebirth, and also we can then say we're just practicing them to have fun here in this life, to be more happy in this life, but just that alone. It's fine to be happy in this life. What it means here is that we're refusing to consider anything beyond that. So when it's that, then these are referred to as four Brahma Vihara, four abodes of the pure, four divine abodes. And these can be very powerful and very transformative still. But when these four, loving kindness and so forth, are permeated with bodhicitta and create the cause for going beyond suffering, they are the full boundless attitudes. So whereas in the Pali textual tradition, we, at least to my knowledge, do not see that strong distinction between the four Brahma Viharas and the boundless attitudes. And we certainly don't see that distinction in modern insight meditation movement writing, that I'm pretty confident about. The Sanskrit tradition does make this distinction quite clearly. And here's another quote from Lobsang Tenpa, whom we have quoted many times already. He's one of the great masters of the Dzogchen tradition, great perfection tradition, which is this incredible and amazing and high and lofty system of practices in the Tibetan lineage associated with understanding and experiencing the true profound nature of our mind. So Lobsang Tenpa also praised as one of the 3 embodiments of the Buddha of wisdom in Tibet's history. So very, very educated, very knowledgeable teacher, therefore, and very eloquent in his writing. Says here, if love, compassion, joy, impartiality, that is an alternative translation for equanimity, of course, impartiality are not connected with the path to liberation, they are the 4 divine abidings, causes of samsara. So as long as we're practicing them just for happiness in this life or even in future lives, unless we're practicing them with an aspiration for personal liberation or full awakening, these states are the 4 Brahma Viharas. They are essentially the states that would lead us to becoming, eventually, one day, becoming like these advanced heavenly beings. But that's a temporary state, not unlike the state of gods on Mount Olympus or any other gods that we might hear about from different mythologies that are not gods in the ultimate sense of being the transcendental reality itself, but are just very powerful beings who are very choosy and picky and like to get angry sometimes, and then they get happy, and then they seek revenge, and then they fight with each other, and all kinds of fun that we can learn about from for example, Greek mythology, that kind of thing. Except in this case, we're talking about beings with much more noble mind, because they just rest in these boundless, but beautiful states of love and so forth, instead of actually fighting and seeking revenge and killing mortals and so forth. They have stuff to do that's more fun than just killing or manipulating mortals. And the stuff that they're doing is resting in this beautiful state of love and so forth. However, if they are connected with a path that leads to peace, they lead beyond the ocean of existence. That is, they would help us to transform the limited body, speech, and mind that we have right now into something that is free. And of course, from the point of view of the Tibetan tradition, there's no point at which we would cease to exist through attaining the 2 types of nirvana, that is personal liberation and full awakening for the sake of all beings. We're not in danger of disappearing. What will happen is that we are going to be alchemically transmuted into a personally liberated being or a fully awakened being. And that would be stepping beyond samsara, stepping beyond the ocean of existence, the ocean of cyclical existence, the ocean of limited existence, the ocean of deluded existence. And that's where we use the beautiful metaphor of waking up. And of course, the word Buddha itself means a being that has woken up to reality, awake, and a being that is awake. So that's what would happen to us with the help of these beautiful states. And even right now, as we're practicing them on these more foundational level, they're helping us wake up to the nature of our experiences. But more specifically, initially, they're helping us to wake up to the interdependent nature of our coexistence with other beings. So we see more closely the ties between ourselves and other beings, the interplay, the mutual dance between our happiness and happiness of other beings. And to wake up to that is already a huge, huge step, not to be overlooked and not to be looked down on when we say, oh, we only need to care about liberation and awakening, and who cares about getting this social intelligence and emotional intelligence and ethical intelligence and ecological intelligence. We just need to be good Buddhists and aspire for full awakening. Well, yeah, we might, if we choose to, but we don't want to end up in the situation where we're incredibly emotionally and ethically and socially inept, and yet we think we're on the path to liberation and full awakening, and yet we're harming ourselves and others through being completely, for example, emotionally stunted. We don't want that. We want the balance of being gracefully present in this life and then gracefully, if we choose to, transcending the limited existence as well. So beautiful. Lobsang Tenpa's writing is always very clear. And so the four immeasurable states, as we've mentioned, become truly immeasurable when they encompass an infinite number of beings, when their intensity becomes absolutely boundless, and when they're also liberated from conditionality from our side, or conditions from our side, where, for example, with loving kindness, we would still be saying, yes, may you be happy, but only if this and that. May you be happy, but only if you do this, and if you do that, and if you believe this. So we're undoing essentially this level of conditioning where we're only able to wish for the happiness of others if they follow our plan, essentially. If they live up to our expectations, they think like us, they look like us, or even if they don't look like us, they believe in what we believe. Or with compassion, as we will see later, the conditioning that we're trying to overcome is the tendency to only be compassionate towards the victims, and not actual victims, not even victims in terms of our intersubjective reality, where we could come together and agree, yes, this person has been a victim of some type of violence. Not even that, but just beings that in our understanding look cute enough and helpless enough. So we're overcoming our tendency to essentially only feel compassion towards children and cats and dogs, maybe other baby animals, but not so much with adults, and obviously not with the perpetrators of any sort of harm. So we're removing that level of a tendency to set conditions for who is deserving of our compassion and so forth. So removing all of that so that these naturally radiate from the core of our being, or they naturally pervade the totality of reality, the wholeness of reality, because as I've mentioned before, it's as if we're taking a step from sitting here and looking at beings with our eyes of loving kindness, which was already a huge step, huge transformation. We make a step from that to becoming the boundless space, all-encompassing space of loving kindness, and all-encompassing space of compassion and empathetic joy and equanimity, as if we ourselves were these four dimensions of reality that at the same time wrap themselves around all beings and pervade all beings and encompass all beings, knowing that all these beings themselves might one day become these four-dimensional beings as well, because their potential for four immeasurables is as great as ours. It's exactly the same potential. And in attending to that potential that we sometimes refer to as basic goodness or Buddha nature and so forth, and multiple names from different traditions. In attending to that, we are better able actually to cultivate loving kindness and so forth. So Maitreya, in addition to that, quotes, mentions in his text known as Ornament of Clear Realizations, or Abhisamalamkara, that these four states would not be truly measurable unless we also cultivate genuine concentration with them, a very profound state of meditative absorption. Well, one day we might, one day we will, in a way, because as Bob Thurman reminds us, awakening is inevitable. So one day, if not even, maybe not in this life, well, one day we will gain those profound states of concentration, because that's what all beings who cultivate bodhicitta, and bodhicitta eventually comes from the four immeasurables. We'll talk about that later in the course. One day we will also master these types of meditative absorption, so then this condition will also be fulfilled. But not all sources mention this condition. But however, all sources agree at least these four states need to become all-encompassing. And also not selfish in the way that, according to the Sanskrit tradition, the four Brahma Vihara are. So if we see some book where the four measurables are taught, and they're mostly referred to as four Brahma Vihara. The four Brahma Vihara, it just means that book is mainly relying on the Pali tradition. There's no problem in that. Nobody is trying to trick us into cultivating the selfish level of these four states. So it's not what's happening. It's just this difference in the way these terms are used. But that's why in our course, we primarily use the term four measurables or four boundless states. And we don't so much talk about the four divine abidings or the four divine abodes. So I hope that clarifies things. And we've mentioned this point before, so now there's elaborate explanation with quotes and everything. And you can always think back to it when you come across these terms in different contexts. And we're going to be transitioning into an exploration of compassion, which is the second of the four measurables, sometimes referred to as the flip side of loving kindness, because they're very closely resemble each other. And both of these states are aspirations. They're not emotions, they're not feelings, even though sometimes we would see them described as emotions or feelings, but very, very vaguely, very loosely. It's not then the formal use of the term emotion. It's not the formal use of the Buddhist concept of feeling or Vedana. It's just essentially referring to them as these mental states that we experience. And some of the more powerful mental states are sometimes called emotions. That's once again not the scientific way of talking about emotions and then defining them in a very specific way with very specific characteristics and so forth. It's just the general way of talking. And so in that case, in that context, we sometimes even see compassion and love being mentioned as emotions is in some books by the Dalai Lama, but that's just this general way of talking. So compassion is very often mentioned as the counterpart to love, or to loving kindness. And of course, the Sanskrit and the Pali term here is karuna. Compassion is most likely the main translation term that is used in English language. And some languages have a little bit of trouble with this term or a little bit of debate around it because they have several ways of translating the English word compassion. And then there's a large discussion around which of these terms to use, which would be more proper, and so forth. Equally, in a way, we could say that the original karuna could also be translated, and it's usually it's not, but it could be translated by, for example, using the word mercy. But mercy in English also has its own. There's a number of associations that come to our mind when we hear the word mercy, and maybe even quite violent ones. You know, we imagine two people on a duel, and then one of them falls and says, "No mercy," as in "don't kill me." Okay, well, that's not the best association for this term at all. However, of course, we do know that when sometimes the beautiful Bodhisattva Kuan Yin or Kanon is mentioned, and that's the Bodhisattva of compassion in this in the Chinese, the Japanese, the Korean, the Vietnamese Buddhist pantheon. When the Bodhisattva of compassion is thus mentioned, she is, or they are, since they adopt both male and female and forms that are neither male or female. When they are referred to as the Bodhisattva of mercy sometimes, or the goddess of mercy. That's quite a common term. So then, or even the Buddha of mercy. And then, of course, that's this very mercy that is meant here, karuna. But compassion is more or less the standard translation for English, and we're going to use that. And then the definition, the wish for a being to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. So with love, it was the wish for a being to have happiness and the causes of happiness and the causes of happiness. We might, thinking back to love, we might recall the definition that Thomas Aquinas gives of love as wishing well upon another. Well, compassion in this case is wishing freedom upon another. But what is that freedom from? It's not freedom from common sense. It's not freedom from social obligations. It's not freedom from interdependence. That doesn't exist. It's not a thing. It's freedom from suffering and the causes of suffering. So this is where we come back to our original discussion of, well, what is happiness? And when we were discussing happiness, its multiple forms, the eudaimonic dimension of happiness, the hedonic dimension of happiness and well-being, we mentioned the umbrella definition from the Buddhist tradition, which described happiness as the state, any state, that we want to continue experiencing when it's already there. We want to continue experiencing happiness because it's pleasant, nice, joyful, comfortable, or that we want to evoke, bring back, awaken, generate, trigger when it's not there. So right now I'm not experiencing the very, very primitive and mundane happiness of eating a Bounty bar. Well, soon enough, I will trigger that for myself because I have access to have a Bounty, but also because I want to. And why do I want to? Because it gives me pleasurable feelings. So that's quite subjective. Some people hate Bounty bars and hate coconuts and hate chocolate and hate all sorts of things, but they enjoy other types of things. And that's, of course, where such diversity in matters of hedonic well-being arises. And of course, that diversity is limited in that, yes, we might like different types of bread, but we all like to be well-fed. We all like to have some food. We don't like to suffer from hunger and die of starvation. Nobody really likes that. So there is some basic conventional facts about reality of happiness. And then there is the more superficial level of being picky and choosy and having very different tastes and preferring this type of music over that type of music, or not liking music at all, being completely obsessed with music and so forth. That's where our different patterns emerge and we see the beautiful diversity. And yet on the more foundational level, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama often says, yes, we're all humans, we have the basic human needs, and we can only hope that those needs would be fulfilled in a dignified manner. Well, we can hope and we can work so that they are fulfilled in a dignified manner. We are trying to change the course of human history so that all societies, all cultures, all countries, all regions, all cities, all towns, and so forth, all human communities essentially, do their best to provide dignified levels of basic human needs to all humans, and also to treat other types of beings on this planet in a very dignified, respectful manner. So that's where the whole conversation around eco-dharma comes in. Well, the same with compassion, except here we reverse the definition and we say that suffering is any state that we want to stop. We want to put an end to it when it's present, and that we want to avoid when it's not present. So this is where we can do a very simple exercise. And you might want to do that just in your thinking or in journaling. And either way is absolutely fine. But the exercise is that we can stop for a moment and think. This is not for the chat, though. This is for us. So you can journal on it in your own actual journal, or you can just think about it. But this is not for other members of the group. But what we can think of is whether right now we are experiencing any types of discomfort in our body, in our mind, and in our life situation. Are there any types of discomfort that are bothering us right now? So let's stop for couple of minutes and just really think about it and try to identify those. What are they? And if you're not finding any types of discomfort in your experience right now, think of whether you're expecting any types of suffering to pop up soon enough, or whether you're worried about any types of suffering that might arise relatively soon. So either the suffering that is currently present, the discomfort that is currently present in our body, mind, and living situation life, or something that might happen and that we would want to avoid, actually. So if we're being honest with ourselves and we're taking a deep look at our experience, at our life, most likely we would be able to identify at least some types of discomfort, or essentially suffering in this case. And they might seem very mundane and superficial compared to the suffering of those who are currently caught in the war zone. Or they might seem completely devastating and incredibly powerful, and no one has suffered as badly as I do right now. That's also a type of perception that might arise. And in this case, before we do any sort of detailed analysis and before we actually start cultivating compassion, the point is just to notice those types of discomfort, to notice and to admit to ourselves that they exist. And then comes the second part of this exercise, which will be a large part of compassion meditation. We need to look at ourselves, to look at our experience, to look at this person sitting here. This person, not meaning not me, not Lobsang Tenpa, but this person as in each one of us. We look at ourselves as if from a side, if you prefer, or from the inside. We're looking at ourselves as this person sitting here, this being sitting here, and then in all the strands of our experience, we need to identify one very powerful thing, one very powerful habit or quality or state or propensity, and that is our basic, our foundational wish to be free from discomfort, to be free from suffering. So before we move on, before we do anything else really, before we do any other type of practice, before we meditate on compassion, we just need to pause, to look at our experience, to truly identify that, and to be able, what we need is to be able to tell ourselves, I don't want to suffer. I don't want to suffer. So let's spend a minute contemplating that and really looking at our experience. So there's that. And then the next step beyond that, which would also be an experiential exploration, and we will be doing that in the actual compassion meditation. The next step after that is to think of other beings now, for example, other participants of this course or other beings around us physically, maybe in the same building or in the 100 feet radius or 100-meter radius. Really anything would work. Thinking of other beings, maybe the beings whose voices we hear and so forth, and knowing, discerning, understanding, seeing. Just like in my case, their experience has multiple, the bubble of their experiences includes multiple types of discomfort. There are multiple types of suffering included in their unique bubble of living. And they might be experiencing different types of physical discomfort. They might be experiencing, most likely they are, different types of mental anguish. Very mild, very strong in some cases, obvious to us, not obvious to us. There's all that. And then in terms of their life, when they think about their situation, they have multiple causes for worry, multiple factors, multiple situations that they're worried about, sad about, concerned about, angry about. So all these sorts of things, body, mind, life. Just like with us, they have all of that. And undeniably, without any sense of doubt, we can see they also, we can say that with a lot of confidence, they want to be free from suffering, just like I want that freedom for myself. So that's a big shift in our perspective. If we truly integrate that, we truly see the world this way. From there, it's just one step towards actual compassion, where we are able to say, first towards ourselves and then towards others, may you be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. So wishing for ourselves and for others to be free from suffering is compassion proper. But compassion has preliminary, it comes from several factors that we need to first combine or gather. One of those factors is care, tenderness, that whole state of tsewa that we've been talking about, just warm-heartedness, not being indifferent, having some warmth in us. So that's important, but we've been working with that or on that through loving kindness, and actually even in simply settling body, speech, and mind, and so forth. We've been working with that in multiple ways. So we still need that. We will need that for all the four immeasurables. But beyond that, we need this element of recognizing suffering and the wish to be free from suffering, or at least knowing that there is suffering and there is a wish to be free from it, at least conceptually understanding that, but hopefully making that large part of our experience. And then from there, actually wishing, may you, may we, may all, may everyone, all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. So the interesting part of compassion practice is being able to say, this is a moment of suffering, and I want to be free from suffering, when we are the one who's suffering. Or with others, being able to notice, hey, when someone is suffering in an obvious way, being able to say, hey, this is a moment of suffering for them. And then when we're talking about other beings, the very important bridge to build there, a very important bridge, is being able to say, and this is something that can elude even practitioners who have been working for a long time, because it's so hard to change habits for all of us. But being able to say, when I suffer, sometimes it's unbearable for me. And it's exactly the same for others. Sometimes when I suffer, all I can do, especially with strong forms of mental anguish, we can think, all I can do is cry, ask for help, with strong forms of physical suffering as well. When they're really, really overpoweringly strong, just all we can do is cry and call for a mother, even if she passed away decades ago. It's just the pain can be so overwhelming. All we can do is cry for help, even when we know no help is coming, or maybe it is, but we don't know, and all we can do is desperately cry out. So unbearable suffering does exist, and it's subjectively unbearable. So we don't like to suffer. Sometimes our emotional or physical experiences are overwhelming for us. And in the same way, when somebody else is experiencing strong happiness, it feels as unbearable for them as it does for me, as mine does for me. So to remind ourselves of that is a huge step, not even yet towards full-blown compassion, perhaps, that requires additional training, but at least towards understanding that the experiences of other beings are as real for them as mine are for me. And this is a very specific wording, very precise wording, because it also means that were I to recognize that all my suffering is mercurial, illusory, devoid of inherent existence, empty from its own side, and so forth, all these advanced types of understanding that come with insight. Were we at some point to say, oh yes, eventually they all are illusory, and when we understand that, we can overcome some levels of suffering and eventually maybe all levels of suffering. We might say that, but we would still know. But for beings who have not yet realized that their suffering is very real, so I will not be walking around and arrogantly telling them, oh, you just need insight, because if you did, your heart wouldn't be broken now. Look at me. I'm completely beyond brokenheartedness, and you're just a mess. We wouldn't be doing that. We would know that's not skillful, not compassionate, and also not true, in that when we were still engrossed in our experience and truly believing the reality of our experience and not having the insight that would pervade the bubble of our experiences, our suffering felt unbearable to us. And nobody was bashing us on the head with all these concepts of emptiness and karma and so forth. Most likely, or hopefully, we received some warmth and some support and a cup of tea, and somebody listened to us compassionately, because that's what we needed at that stage, not somebody talking about all these lofty concepts. That might eventually come up, but gradually and over time. So once again, this is about finding that middle ground between being a Buddhist or a representative of any other tradition that is very deeply focused on the insights of that tradition, and just being a decent, empathetic, compassionate human being. This is where compassion is one of the practices where this interplay is very beautifully illustrated by our own attempts at finding that middle ground. And slowly we will. We just need to keep reminding ourselves to, oh, I shouldn't fall into this extreme, I shouldn't fall into that extreme. And then constantly balancing it all out. So the process of cultivating this wish, may all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering, means that we initially direct our attention to one being. Eventually later on, it's a group of beings, then eventually all beings. But we start with one being and we generate this very aspiration. And while for loving kindness, sometimes we use more elaborate formulas, sometimes we just use a simple phrase, sometimes, and in the long run, we wouldn't need the phrase at all. We just need the actual aspiration itself, and it would be less conceptual than on the initial stages of practice. It will take a long time to fully go non-conceptual. That's what advanced beings are capable of, non-conceptual loving kindness, non-conceptual compassion, and so forth. With us, we would still need some level of concepts, but it will become less gross, less crude in terms of actually having to repeat the phrase again and again, for example, in our mind and focus on it hard and strongly. But for compassion, it's more or less uniform. In the Pali traditions, when Pali tradition, and of course there are multiple lineages that practice on the basis of the Pali textual tradition, but in that whole bandwidth of teachings, we would often just see the phrase, "May you be free from suffering," full stop. And in the Tibetan tradition, as we've discussed, this additional element of recognizing the causes comes. May you be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. Well, and then there's the question, do we need, that was asked before, do we need to know all the causes of suffering? And think about, well, the Buddha said that the causes of suffering are karma and delusions and all this and that. And also from the point of view of medicine, the causes of my suffering would be this and this and this and this. And then from the point of view of systems thinking and ecological science, the causes of our climate suffering are this and this and this. It does help to know, absolutely it does. And yet, well, there's only so much that we know right now. And on all of these points, we might have some conceptual understanding that, yes, this disease was brought about by those factors. Or we might have no understanding, actually. Just, okay, I'm sick. Horrible, unpleasant, painful, disappointing, heartbreaking. Well, knowing that there is that type of suffering is good enough. Any causes that led to it, may they be eliminated, especially the essential causes, the ones that are most responsible for a specific type of suffering arising. And this is where, quite simply, we can say, for hedonic suffering that is stimulated by something from the outside, someone is, I don't know, punching me in the face. That's hedonic suffering, as in someone is providing negative stimulation. Okay, well, there are hedonic causes for that, causes and conditions that have unfolded in the outer reality. And then for eudaimonic suffering, the suffering that is essentially just not feeling good about existence, not having that inner joy, inner bliss, inner well-being. It comes from our mind not being truly balanced yet. It comes from our mind being obscured by multiple negative factors. It comes from our mind not yet knowing its true potential, not showing its true potential. Okay, any of these descriptions would work. So we start with them, and then we slowly, hopefully, move away from both hedonic and eudaimonic suffering. But between the two, as we might remember, the one that we have more control over due to its nature, to its very nature, is the eudaimonic suffering. But the bitter irony, just like with hedonic happiness and eudaimonic happiness, the bitter irony is that we're taught way more about how to attain hedonic happiness and avoid hedonic suffering, and we're not really taught anything if we grow up in a materialistic, capitalist, consumerist, and so forth. We could put a number of different nouns there when we think about each individual society that we grew up in. And these nouns would slightly change because your materialistic society, a materialist society might be more communist than capitalist. There's all those little permutations here and there, but the point is, this whole system together made me believe I should mainly focus or exclusively focus on the hedonic, and therefore I was not equipped with any sort of emotional hygiene tools. And now I suffer. Now I feel really bad. And it's not my fault. It's not per se anyone's fault, other than the fact that we find ourselves in this situation where it's not truly balanced. Well, this is we then recognize, hey, I can do something. I don't have to live in this suffering. And then we do that. So what we'll do now is we do a practice of compassion where we actually take the initiative. And before that, let's just spend a moment or two compassionately stretching, compassionately moving around, compassionately finding a comfortable meditation position, drinking water or tea, just taking good care of our body before we ask it to rest in the meditation position for the next 15 minutes. And if there is some discomfort in the body that we can alleviate through, for example, adopting a different posture or drinking water, or putting on more layers or removing some of the layers of our clothing and so forth, let's do that. Let's be compassionate, because we're doing that with mindful awareness in this case. So in some cases, we almost automatically, we try to remove the suffering and or discomfort, but because there's very little wisdom, awareness, mindfulness, and other positive mental factors, where very few of them are involved, we end up, instead of ending up with less suffering, we end up with a mess or even more suffering. So that sometimes happens. And global wars are a good example of that, but there's many other examples as well of, oh, I'm going to remove the source of suffering. Oh, no. Oh, it didn't work. Oh, it all backfired. And now I'm in a very, very, very complicated mess. That happens a lot. In this case, we're trying to exercise our ability to remove the suffering skillfully and with awareness. And we're taking our own body as an example. So do I need to change the way my legs are resting? Do I need to move my shoulders? Do I just need a bit more water? Do I need to open the window? What can I do to remove some of the excessive discomfort, some of the discomfort that is not necessary, that can be removed? And then with that, we will start working on our mind. So adopting a meditation posture that would be supportive and stable enough for us. Then bringing our awareness to the physical body and the parts of the body that are still, hopefully comfortably and sustainably, relying on the ground beneath us. Allowing some of our physical tension to slowly and gradually melt, leaving our body. Noticing the stillness already present in our feet and toes, in our legs, maybe also in our hands if they're relaxed enough. And then allowing this experience of ease, stillness, vigilance to expand, to encompass our entire body as we rest here. Abiding in naturalness. And breathing naturally. Entrusting ourselves to this natural process of breathing so that through our mindful awareness of it and through the body breathing in a natural manner without any control from our side, all knots of tension can be gradually removed. So let's spend a couple of minutes just mindfully breathing, attending to the sensations associated with the breath throughout the body, or if you prefer, in the abdominal area or in the area of the nostrils. And then on the basis of this, recalling our highest aspirations for contemplative practice in general, returning to our aspirations, to our long-term aspirations for happiness and well-being, for freedom and well-being, and directing this very practice of compassion towards that goal. And with that as our foundation, we bring our awareness to this very person sitting here, that is, to ourselves, noticing our current experiences, and amongst those, noticing different types of discomfort, either already obviously present, for example, emotional pain or physical discomfort, or lurking somewhere in the background, if we're thinking about different problems in our life that sometimes cause worry, stress, and so forth. So just noticing, yes, there are different types of suffering in my life, perhaps. And then also noticing our underlying or foundational wish to be free from suffering. Noticing in a clear, obvious way that, yes, indeed, we do not want to suffer. And then with the same type of tenderness, care, affection that we used in loving kindness practice, where we're just holding this very person in warm-hearted awareness, we generate compassion, or allow this tender care to crystallize into compassion, to crystallize into the very clear wish. May I be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And just like we did with the aspiration that is loving kindness, we're allowing this wish to grow in our mind, to pervade our body and mind. And to just be, to be present in our awareness. The object of awareness is this person practicing here. The mode of awareness is compassion. We're looking at this very person and we're seeing this person, that is ourselves, through the lens of wishing. May I be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. Why? Because I have the potential to be free. Or at least the potential to be more free than now. If we choose, we can strengthen the aspiration with each out breath or just rest in it. And of course, just like with loving kindness, we return to the aspiration and we reinvite it, reawaken it every time it seems to dissipate, disappear, get lost, become less strong. So for 2-3 minutes, we'll just rest in this wish. May I be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. Returning to the aspiration again and again, but not simply to recite it mentally as a phrase or a mantra or even a prayer. The main purpose of the aspiration or the phrase is to modulate our awareness of the object. The object is the person. And we perceive that person, we attend to this person through the lens of wishing for this person to be free from suffering and its causes. And yet it is helpful to return to the aspiration of the phrase every time we get lost. That's part of our training in shamatha. In a way, when the 5 hindrances that we have discussed when talking about shamatha, the 5 hindrances that we have read about, that we have explored, when they appear in the mind, they can also be seen as causes of suffering or as subtypes of suffering. So then, with gentleness, we wish for ourselves to also be free of those. And that wish itself gradually dispels the clouds, the dark clouds of the 5 hindrances. And then to create some positive interdependence in the practice, we can even imagine ourselves actually being free, or much more free from suffering than now. Envisioning that state of ease, well-being, clarity, the state where the absence of suffering is very clear, very strongly present for us. As if we were expecting that suffering to be there, but it was not, because it's gone. And then extending our awareness, our attention, and also our care, our warm-heartedness, our tenderness to the other practitioners, or if we're doing this by means of a recording, to other beings around us in the same building, in the same vicinity. Basically projecting our awareness towards others, and then taking a few moments to practice empathy on a very basic level, where we simply recognize, yes, these beings, just like me, do experience different types of discomfort. Just like me, these beings have the wish to be free from suffering and its causes. And then with our tenderness that in this case embraces all these beings that we're tending to. Some of them we would be more clearly aware of, some of them would just appear to us as a vague idea. Doesn't matter. With tenderness, we're able to mentally say and wish, may we be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. Because we know, just like me, these beings do not enjoy their suffering. Just like me, they want to be free. And they have the same potential for freedom, clarity, spaciousness. May we be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And then for the final step, which is more of an approximation of the actual thing, a facsimile of immeasurable compassion, we think of all beings, indeed, however many there might be, knowing three basic facts. If these are sentient beings, that is, unenlightened beings, they also have different types of suffering. They don't enjoy that suffering. They want to be free from it. And perhaps they also possess basic goodness, which means there can be freedom, or at least a greater degree of freedom. So we then allow our tenderness to once again crystallize into compassion, in this case, all-encompassing compassion. May all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And then for just a few moments, once again, for positive interdependence, we can imagine all beings actually resting in freedom. Freedom from suffering. Finding ease, relief. Breathing freely. And especially being eudaimonically free. And then with that, we release all aspirations or wishes or images, all thoughts, to simply rest with our body, grounding ourselves in its breath, in its sensations, and in its contact with the ground. And then we introduce some movements to the body by, once again, rocking back and forth or moving gently, perhaps doing slow circular motions if we're sitting up. And moving our hands and fingers, our toes and our feet, stretching if we feel the need to. And then slowly, gradually concluding this practice. Normally, if this was a standalone session, we would also dedicate the energy of this meditation, just like we generated the motivation in the beginning of it. But we only have a few minutes left in this session, just a little bit over 15. So we'll do a short dedication of effort at the end of the session. Once again, using compassion for it as the basis or the framework for it. But yes, if we were meditating on compassion on our own, we would also take that step and mentally dedicate the energy of this practice to our highest aspirations and perhaps to all beings indeed being free from suffering and the causes of suffering. So, of course, just like with loving kindness, a large and important part of the discussion of compassion is its opposites or the obstacles to the cultivation of compassion. And some of the obstacles are the same obstacles as for any other shamatha type practice. And once again, in the Pali tradition, and especially in the teaching tradition of Buddhaghosa, which for a long time was the dominant teaching tradition in the lineage or multiple lineages that rely on Pali sources. For a long time, in that whole system, compassion is classified as one of the practices of samadhi, or practices that allow us to cultivate mental composure or concentration as a precursor to insight, but also, of course, as a thing that is transformative in itself. It is transformative to be truly compassionate in a balanced, clear, sustainable, and sustained manner. Very powerful. We do want to see, as Maitreya calls it, the revolution of altruism, the revolution of compassion. And in some cases, or in some ways, facetiously, It is a wording that comes from somewhat questionable, but also somewhat helpful discussions around the so-called revolution of mindfulness, which is this marketing term, essentially, that is applied to the popularization of modern day popular mindfulness techniques. There we can see some magazine covers, or we could see a few years ago, some magazine covers we would see meditating people, usually painfully white, painfully young, painfully cisgender. We would see the people of that category depicted as meditating very, very mindfully. And then we would see slogans like revolution of mindfulness is upon us, or just the revolution of mindfulness. And the idea was that, of course, now that mindfulness is becoming more popular and that you can become a mindfulness teacher literally on every corner, and that corporations are starting to commodify mindfulness to use it on their employees so that their employees revolt less often, essentially, that because of that, a true revolution of mindfulness has happened and the world is now mindful. Well, we know there's truth to it in that mindfulness is becoming more popular. And that in itself is a good thing, because if mindfulness is taught properly, and that's a large discussion in itself. And I just mean popular mindfulness. I don't mean properly as in, oh, is it in accordance with the ancient texts of Buddhism? Well, that's not the biggest issue. That is an issue, but the biggest issue is it taught in a way that is trauma-informed, that is helpful for practice, applicable, inspiring, actually helps people to do the work of emotional hygiene. That's the main thing to begin with. So if it is taught that way, then its popularity is well-deserved, and then it's actually beneficial because it is one of very important skills for being decent human beings and for being able to show up in multiple ways to protect the planet, to offer our services to society, to be kind and loving towards our family, to be better members of our communities, a very, very important thing, relational mindfulness, and so forth, all of that. So that's true, that's valid. The problem is that we are certainly not witnessing the all-pervasive revolution of mindfulness, because it's not enough to just teach everyone to be a mindfulness teacher, especially if that education is not a very high quality. We do need more mindfulness teachers, but we do need for them to be very well trained and very ethical, and we also need for them to have a lot of life experience. And that's actually a very interesting observation from the anecdotal Buddhist tradition, I should say, where generally, and that's an observation that I've heard from some yogis, people who are better equipped to teach these skills are people who have suffered a lot. Emotionally, physically, in terms of historical events, and so forth. Because if we are very young, very privileged, never saw a day of genuine, heart-wrenching, horrifying suffering that some people have experienced, and only saw very minor types of heartbreak, let's put it that way, we do have some reference points for talking about all of this material, but it doesn't go deep enough in many cases because we're still very largely in that bubble of privilege. But over time, as we go through life or experience multiple heartbreaks and so forth, we become better equipped to understand all of those types of suffering and to therefore experience more profound states of compassion, and to be also able to talk about all of this from personal experience, which is why actually for a mindfulness teacher, it's a blessing, and I digress, but it's a blessing to have marginalized identities. It's a curse in that there's more suffering, but to have those marginalized identities is a blessing in that we are therefore we have at least a better chance of being understanding of others who are suffering because they're marginalized. But for compassion, this is all very important stuff, actually. So within that, the next step after the revolution of mindfulness would hopefully the revolution of compassion, where in addition to mindfulness and empathy, which is also quite strongly emphasized in some corporate work that has been on the market, at least in the United States, for multiple years now. I don't know how omnipresent that is in the United Kingdom and in other countries, but certainly in the United States, empathy has become a big buzzword, and compassion is only slowly coming there. And of course, compassion, for it to be truly a revolution of compassion, it has to go beyond the commodified form of, well, just be compassionate to yourself and, just hold yourself in a nice loving embrace and so forth. No, it has to involve systems thinking, undoing, patriarchy and racism and all kind of xenophobic and violent thinking and all of that. But within that, for a revolution of compassion to truly happen, we would need to undo all these obstacles here. So the Pali tradition sometimes describes them as despair, and there are multiple translations possible here. So sometimes the close enemy or the false facsimile. So it looks like compassion, but it's not. Looks like a duck, but it's not a duck. So in this case, it looks like compassion, but it's not compassion, and that is despair. And despair in this case, there are multiple forms of despair, multiple ways of describing despair. But in this case, what it refers to is us seeing suffering. Oh, there is suffering in the world. And being so heartbroken about it that we can't do anything, that we feel the energy leaving our body, leaving our mind, and we just sit there and cry. And that's understandable in that it is heartbreaking. It is overwhelming, the level of suffering in the world. And sometimes even in our own life, we look at one individual and we see all the strands of suffering that this one individual might have experienced in their life. Some stories, unimaginable, but in a way that's every story, unimaginable levels of suffering. That's the horror. That's why Buddhists are so passionate about overcoming samsara, going beyond samsara, and why some Buddhists are also super passionate about leading all beings away from samsara, because each story of each human being, and of course of each animal as well, and other types of beings, can be told in a way where we highlight the suffering, and then we see, wow. But the conclusion that compassion makes is different from the conclusion that despair makes, because the despair, this false facsimile, then feels disempowered, loses energy, whereas compassion feels actual compassion. Compassion proper feels more empowered because of that. So that's something that we want to avoid when we're practicing compassion. If we're seeing that our compassion starts turning into despair, that's where we need to take a gentle step back, recharge our battery, and then continue practicing compassion so as to keep our battery charged. Or when we practice all four immeasurables together, when we know how to balance them, there's a specific strategy for how to balance compassion with empathetic joy, and to make sure that compassion never turns into despair. We're going to talk about that in the last part of the course. So that's the false facsimile. Actual compassion does not feel disempowered, slowly. Empathetic distress is, as a question, a comment here. Some of my teachers talk about the near enemy of compassion as empathetic distress. That's one way of putting it. That being said, empathetic distress is a specific term from modern psychology. It is very close in meaning, but this is where I think there's also some benefit in saying this is the term as it came to us from the actual textual tradition of Buddhist practices. This is a similar term in psychology, and we can see the beautiful interplay between them. They're not necessarily the same. And that being said, the actual term that is closer to this state from modern psychology is compassion fatigue. Empathetic distress or empathic distress is actually a more general term that can imply several other nuances, can have some other nuances to it, that compassion fatigue is more precise. But all of these terms together, they form a semantic field, we could say, and we can see the beauty of each one, and then the differences between them. So then the far enemy of compassion is the propensity for violence, which is a stronger version of the same malice or maliciousness that we saw, or just aversion that we saw with loving kindness. So when we see the opposite of loving kindness, it is in some cases just saying, may you not have happiness and the causes of happiness. In some cases, it's wishing for others to have unhappiness even, but with the opposite of compassion, it becomes more extreme. And compassion in itself actually is a more dynamic quality, we could say, than loving kindness. And similarly, its opposite is more dynamic than the opposite of loving kindness. So this opposite of compassion is actually propensity for violence, or our wish to enact violence, our willingness to enact violence, to actually punch someone or hurt someone or say something mean, or of course to construct whole systems of oppression just to put other people down, very specific people, to punish them, to destroy them, and so forth. All of that. That is the far enemy of compassion. And it is an interesting thing to observe in our own mind, because until compassion has become truly all-encompassing, right, we would be seeing that we're still sometimes experiencing this state, the wish to be violent towards people we see as evildoers in this world. Oh, this person is destroying the planet. If I could, I would torch their house, or whatever, something like that. It could still be there. And removing it does not mean we become, once again, passive. We're no longer good at setting healthy boundaries. No. We do need, if our compassion is genuine, to be able to set healthy, wise boundaries, to speak very clearly to people about why specific types of behavior, especially political behavior, are unacceptable because they are, for example, destroying the planet, and so forth. But that's different from just feeling, I'm going to destroy you and torch your house. Wisdom could be an antidote to despair. For example, that's the an observation from the chat. For example, trying to remember that all the suffering occurs on a level of reality similar to a waking dream, that it is not the ultimate reality. Yes, wisdom is the greatest antidote to despair. That being said, with the example, I would be a little bit careful there, because wisdom that understands ultimate reality is not the only type of wisdom that's necessary. In the Buddhist system of contemplative practice, we sometimes say we need two types of wisdom. One type of wisdom is the one that sees through appearances. And the other type of wisdom is the wisdom that sees the interdependence of appearances, and especially their causal interdependence. So one of these types of wisdom is in itself, well, not quite enough. Let's put it very simply, because simply saying, oh, it's all a dream, once again, to a friend that's truly heartbroken, that's not good enough. And also when we are heartbroken, telling ourselves, oh, it's all a dream, might work and it might not work. So when we have both types of wisdom, however, the interplay between them would be very empowering. It would be very empowering is that through seeing the ultimate, we have a very light touch on reality. And through seeing the conventional in all the interconnections in the conventional, we would be very skillful in still performing the dance that is necessary for us to go through life, to help other beings, and so forth. So that's, of course, wisdom is the greatest balancing agent for all four immeasurables. And until that wisdom has been cultivated, the four immeasurables try to support each other. So they're waiting for the great savior that is wisdom to appear. And it will, if we're cultivating it actively through insight practices and so forth, contemplating interdependence, all of that. But as they're waiting for that, the four friends, the four siblings that are the four immeasurables, they're trying to balance each other. So in that case, compassion is balanced by empathetic joy. We're going to talk about that later. However, and these are final observations for today, Jigme Lingpa and Longchenpa also say that the far enemy of, so this is where we switch to the Tibetan tradition. The far enemy can be described as the attitude of malice, but it's close enough to violence, once again, wanting for bad things to happen to people and for us to do bad things to people. However, the near enemy is very interesting here, because Jigme Lingpa also mentions that desire can be that enemy. And of course, desire here does not refer to simply desire of, oh, I'm going to have that same bounty bar or something like that. That's just not consequential enough. It especially probably refers, and that's my interpretation, to the stronger forms of desire that, when we focus on other beings, prevent us from seeing them as agents of suffering, as beings who want to be free, as beings who actually have actual experiences, and instead make us objectify those other beings, in that we're only seeing them as functions, not as beings. And we do know that this form of desire is very antithetical to compassion, and it's very dangerous. And it's exactly the type of desire that leads people to, for example, committing sexual crimes, as in raping others and subjecting others to all sorts of non-consensual behavior. Why? Because instead of seeing another being through the eyes of empathy and compassion, or empathy, loving kindness, compassion, all of that, we're seeing them as if they were food or toys and so forth. And that's a horrible mental state, of course, to cultivate or to be habituated to, but it is something that we often notice in ourselves and in others, and of course, so pervasive across multiple cultures. And yet compassion serves as an antidote to this type of desire. This also refers, of course, to animals and, for example, destroying their natural habitats because for us, they're less than. I want this piece of land, so I'm going to cut down this forest. And if all the apes have to die because of that, well, I want that piece of land anyway. You know, all sorts of things like that. Of course, consuming animals for food, and beyond that, there are many other types of suffering that are many other types of desire like that completely block compassion from our mind, from arising in our mind. So that's another interesting note that Jigme adds here. I think it's worth contemplating. So we're going to stop here. It's actually 1 minute past, but before that, let's just rest for a second and mentally dedicate the energy of this class, this practice, this session, this contemplation, this discussion to our highest aspirations and the well-being of the world. And unsurprisingly, for the home play part of this part of the course, the invitation would be to practice compassion using guided practices, or on your own if you feel confident in that. Absolutely. The invitation would be to read the chapter of the Four Immeasurables book on compassion, and to explore this experientially, and also to try practicing now compassion in informal practice, whether in walking, meditation, or just when doing other things, because the point of this course is, once again, to play around with this material, to play with it a little bit. So let's play with the practice of compassion now, slowly, gently, and see how it makes us feel, so that next time, and we will be doing the regular check-in in the beginning of next session, we can clarify some things and share some things if we feel inspired to. So that's going to be our practice for this week. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing you 7 days from now. So please enjoy a practice of compassion. Please have a wonderful, beautiful week. And let's see each other soon. Hopefully, seeing that after these 7 days, we are already more compassionate with ourselves and with others. So my deepest gratitude to you and to, of course, the supporting team, and see you all soon. Thank you.